Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is right at the middle of May, and I cannot believe it, but school has been let out here, and I have a high schooler and a middle schooler, which is kind of throwing me for a little bit of a curveball. But what a great and fun way to start my summer. So I would love to hear from you guys. Drop in the chat what's going on with you for this summer. Did you have kids that are also graduating and having a little bit of a heart attack here, as parents do at that time of year, this time of year? It's been a great sunny week here in Georgia this week, so I'm super excited. The weather has cooperated for the most part, although I did just hear a bit of thunder. But you know what? We'll welcome a shower because it has been a beautiful 80 to 85 degrees this week. And I, for one, will take that. I have a client that's moving up from Florida, and I've talked to him a couple of times this week, and he has said that it's just scorching there. So I will take it. I will definitely take just our little 80 degrees. But today we're going to dive straight in. I want to go over today mainly how you can avoid paying taxes, but doing it legally. So that's the big key point because we don't want anybody getting in trouble here, but how you can avoid paying taxes when you go to sell your home. Because one of the biggest concerns and quite frankly, just irritations, if I'm honest, of when you sell your home is you're having to pay those capital gains taxes on specific types of property. So if you're wanting to sell and not have to be able to do that, what are your options to be able to avoid paying those taxes? Glad to be here again for the live session. So glad to have you. I sincerely, sincerely appreciate you guys tuning in. It's always a great time. And I love when people are on so that way we can have communication back and forth and I can try and make sure that I'm answering any questions live while you are here. Anthony, I know it made your heart being an accountant and in that entire field that I said legally. Yes, this is all legal. I am not giving anybody any bad advice on how to just do things illegally because that would not be a great thing, especially being here recorded and then somebody could share it. So that being said, let's dive straight in. So obviously, we're going to kind of use some mocks today, right? And I've got my notes here that you'll probably see me continuing to look at just because I want to make sure that I'm telling you everything exact because this is tax implications if you're not following directions. This is the IRS that we're dealing with. And we all know that they don't play around. So, that being said, looking at this is really going to be looking at, let's just say that when you first purchased a home, maybe you were single, you were in your, mid 20s, early 30s, whatever. You bought a property, bought a house, and let's say that you bought that house for around $300,000, right? This was just your first place. Maybe you and some girlfriends, stayed in it for college, or maybe it was your first bachelor pad, right? And then down the road, you got married, had kids, you moved into a larger home, a different property, but you decided to keep property A as an investment property. And so you've had a tenant in there, and now life's just changing, and you've decided, you know what? I think I'm done with that property and I want to get rid of it, but now you're looking at paying a hefty capital gains taxes. So what are your options? Well, first of all, let's just say again that you paid around $300,000 for that initial property. Then you go and you meet with the real estate agent, and we tell you that that property could probably be sold today for around $600,000. So, looking at the comps around, we're thinking that you're going to be making around a $300,000 gain, which, let's just be honest, that is not chump change. So to be making $300,000, but then you're looking at paying taxes on that. So you're looking at the only two things that we know that are guarantees in life are death and taxes. So that being said, how can we kind of avoid giving Uncle Sam his unfair share? Well, there are a couple of different ways that you can do it. Again, legally, let me make sure that I clarify. And so realistically, the first one that we're going to be looking at here is going to be option one is to move back into the property. This is probably the cleanest, easiest way to avoid paying those taxes, those capital gains taxes, is if you move back in to the property. Because if you are married and filing jointly, then you're looking at a tax exclusion of up to $500,000. So realistically, the money that you would be making, that $300,000, you would be able to have a tax exemption for that full amount, because if you're married filing jointly, then you will have been able to completely wipe that out because you have up to $500,000 that you can have an exclusion for. Now, that being said, there are a couple of things you have to keep in mind. Number one, you have to have lived in the property. A lot of people get this part confused, so make sure you're hearing me here. A lot of people think that you have to have lived in the property for the previous 2 years prior to selling, and that's not the case. So for the last 5 years that you've owned the property, so let's just say it's 2024, you bought this house back in 2018, okay? And so for 2 years, you lived in the property. It doesn't have to be the last 2 years. It doesn't have to be consecutive 2 years. But for the last 5 years, you have to have lived in that property for at least 2 of those 5 years for you to qualify for that tax exemption. So if you haven't lived in it, if you bought it solely for the purpose of an investment property from the get-go and you've never lived in that property, then you're going to have to move back into that property for at least 2 years. Now, maybe you lived in it for 2 years already, or maybe you lived in it for 1 and then rented it out. Now you can move back into that property for 1 year, and then you could turn around and sell it, and you would be able to exclude up to that $500,000 mark because you are married filing jointly. Now, that being said, you want to make sure that you're filing it and you're talking to your tax CPA and letting them know everything that, is going on, making sure that you're looking at the years, because if it's more than 5 years, you're going to need to be in that property again. So you really have to look at when you were last in the property and make sure that it was 2 out of the last 5 years, because that's a pretty big one. Otherwise, you could have tax implications that nobody wants to have. Now, another option is going to be a 1031 exchange. And this is something that we see a lot of investors doing. And so this is something that I'm very familiar with. We have investors that will continuously do that, do use the 1031 exchange just as they are investing and then reinvesting their money. And so a lot of people will say, well, how do they avoid taxes? This is it right here. And let me be clear. This is still perfectly legal. They are not paying taxes. They're just what's called deferring them. So with a 1031 exchange, basically what you're going to look at doing is if you could imagine just basically flopping one property from the other. So the money that you make from one house, let's say you have house A and you're selling it for $600,000. Again, you originally purchased it for $300,000. So now you're making $300,000. You are now going to turn around and you're going to take that $300,000 that you are making and you're going to reinvest that on another property. And you have 45 days from the time that you sell house A to then reinvest that into house B. Now, the key thing here is you don't have to necessarily be closed on house B, but you do have to at least be under contract on house B. So realistically, you sell house A and you reinvest the money that you make onto house B. You have to be at least under contract on house B within 45 days of closing on the previous property to make sure that you are not going to incur those capital gains taxes. So this is another option that we see a lot of people, take, especially when we're looking at investors that are going to be consistently reinvesting in the market. They don't want to cash out. They're not trying to, take the money and just put it back in the bank account. They're wanting to consistently reinvest in the market. And this is a great way for them to do that. Now, there are a couple of things that you have to keep in mind with the 1031 exchange. With this, please don't think, because I've heard, and I don't want to say wannabe investors, but people that are not educated on the market, and they say, well, I will flip a couple of $1 million properties and then I will sell that and I'll reinvest that money into a lesser expensive property, and then I will take the hit on taxes on that lesser expensive property. That's not how this works. The government is on to you. Uncle Sam is going to make sure that he gets his unfair share. We all know that. And so really and truly, when you're looking at selling a property, if you're wanting to do a 1031 exchange, it has to be for a like property. So if you're selling a multi-million-dollar property, you're going to be reinvesting that in a similar multi-million-dollar property. If you're looking at selling a townhome, you're going to be looking at a property that is similar. Now, it doesn't have to specifically be a townhome, but you're looking at properties that are dollar for dollar going to be similar, because they're not going to let you sell $1 million property, make $800,000, and then reinvest only like $200,000 of that, and then you're taking the rest. That's just not how it works. They're smarter than that. And so when you finally get to, let's just say you've been doing this for a while and you get to that last property and you say, you know what, I'm done. I don't want to reinvest. That's when you really have to look and think about the fact, okay, well, what do I want to do with it at this time? I could go back to option one, where it's the fact of living in it for 2 years, because you are able, even if this was a 1031, you are able to at some point make this a primary residence if you so choose. You just have to prove to the IRS that you did initially purchase this property for investment purposes. Right. And so once you have, maybe you've used it for a rental for a couple of years, and now you've decided you're going to cash out, you're done. So now you and the family move into this property for a 2-year period. You could then turn around and sell the property after that 2 years and bypass those capital gains, which is what we see a lot of investors end up doing when they've kind of maxed out what they're wanting to do as far as transferring that money, switching out one house for another. And keep in mind, this is not for what we in the business call flip properties. So if you're wanting to buy a property today and within the next 2 to 3 months, you're looking at turning that property around, renovating it, putting it back on the market, a 1031 exchange is not for you in this situation. A 1031, you're looking at holding on to that property for a minimum of 2 years. So this is going to be a long-term gain. This is a property that you're looking at purchasing, and you're looking at putting long-term tenants into this property. And so this is something that you're probably looking at holding on to for minimum 2 years or even more. And so that way, then at that 2-year mark, you can either sell that property, reinvest into another, or like I said, you can cash out. You would pay the capital gains tax at that point, or you could then move into it, show the IRS that, hey, I bought this with the intention of it being a rental. I've had tenants in it, and now my family and I are moving in it. We're living in it for 2 years, and then you avoid paying those gains. Now, the last option that you have is to just take the hit, right? But if you choose to go that route, which sometimes it's just the easiest thing to do, maybe like I said, you bought this as your bachelor pad. Now you've been living with your wife and kids and whatever for years, and now the market looks good and you stand to make a substantial chunk of change, and so you figure, you know what, I'm it's just time for me to sell. I will say this, make sure that you are keeping up with all of your expenses, all of your receipts, because anything that you've had to do to that property while you've had tenants in there is now tax deductible. So if you had to do something this year in order to get that property ready to sell, if you had to put in a new AC unit, if you had to put in new carpet, new flooring, new cabinets, anything that you had to do to that property in order to get that property up and running and really ready to be listed and put on the market, you can now use as a tax write-off, a tax deduction. Now, obviously, you are not going to get that full, exemption of the $500,000. But you would be able to have something that is able to be a write-off. So any of those expenses that you incurred, you would at least be able to get something back, and not take the full hit for some of the expenses that you had purchased. Um, One of the questions I get is, well, what if I'm not married? What do I still get the 500,000? So no, you would not. If you are single and this is just a property that you had as an investment property, you would be looking at around $250,000. So basically half. It's, similar to taxes, right? So let's dive into some of the questions and see what we have. Miss Betty, good to see you. Um, Ray Taylor, no taxes. You have my intention. Yes, let's be honest. Anytime that we can not pay taxes, that would be great. But Uncle Sam is always going to make sure that they get us with that. So, Anthony, would those improvements also help my basis in the property as well and minimize my potential gain on sale? Yes, that's a great question. It would. So it would really just depend on what all you're putting into the property. But obviously, anytime, if you have a property that you're looking at investing into, that is going to, you know, it's going to help you sell it for more money, but then you can turn around and, like I said, you can have that as a write-off because it's money that you had to put in. So especially if you're having to put in a large amount, let's say that you've had the property rented for quite a few years and now you go in and tenants just haven't really taken great care of it, right? So now you're looking at having to replace carpets, you're having to replace some faucets, maybe some lighting, maybe you're having to do a fresh coat of paint throughout, and realistically, you're looking at putting $20,000 or $30,000 into this property to then be able to turn around and sell the property. That would all be something that you could have on your taxes, as a write-off. So that's definitely going to help you in that field, especially if you're wanting to just cash out and not have to really deal with the property anymore. Because sometimes, you have a family now. You're not wanting to move them back into a property to have, you have lived there for the last 5 years. You're not wanting to reinvest it. You're really and truly not an investor. That's not your thing, right? You bought this property for you at the beginning and that was your intention. And then along the way, you ended up moving to another home and it made sense to you at the time to hold on to this property. Sometimes, like right now, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to sell something if you have a substantially low interest rate because you bought it in, the downturn and you're like, hey, you know what? We could rent this out, keep our significantly low interest rates, go ahead and buy the home that fits our family's needs at this point because we're a growing family or we're being relocated, whatever it is that makes it make sense for you to purchase right now. But you can realize that you could then rent out that property and hold on to it. So, you really have to look at checks and balances. Make sure that it's making sense for you and for your family. Have to be within a year and a half of sale, I think. It's actually 45 days, right? So if you have a home, let's call it home A, and you're looking at selling that home and you want to reinvest, by the time you sell that property, you have to then have a new property under contract within a 45-day period. That's my fear with a rental property. The tenants would end up destroying the property. Betty, we hear that a lot. it, it can't happen, right? Tenants are never going to love the property the same that you do because it was your property. It's your investment. It's your literal name on the line that holds the interest to that property. So most of the time, no, a tenant is not going to care for the home the way that you do. However, that's why you are able to take those expenses and use them as tax benefits to you, tax write-offs for you, because the government knows that you're going to have to put money back into this house. Hopefully, you vetted the tenants, you did a credit check, you had, down payments and deposits and things like that. Now, let's be honest, y'all. When you look at a deposit for a rental, you're probably looking at first and last month's rent, so it's not going to be a substantial amount of money. You're maybe looking at $2,000 to $3,000 that you're going to get to keep if they did do damage to the house. That $2,000 to $3,000 isn't even going to cover the cost of the carpet that they've now destroyed. So I'm well aware of what can go on with a tenant. That's just something that you have to be willing to take the risk. Because if you watch the video last week, the live last week that we talked about, if you're looking at an investment property, what we were going over last week was the fact of property prices continue to rise. And I'm not just talking about in the 2020s. We are already up in the 2020s. So from 2020 to 2024, we are already up 47%. So if you bought a home in 2019 or 2020, you've made about a 50% equity increase in the property that you purchased. That is substantial. But even if you bought a property back in, let's say 2006, 2007, when 2008, all of a sudden everything crashed and you lost 30 to 40% of your property, what you put into it, if you held on to that property long term and you held on to it for 9 or 10 years, you would have not only made your money back, but you would have made a substantial amount after that on top of that. So yes, you are taking a little bit of a risk with having tenants in there, but think of the equity gains that you're gaining long term. And if you're making, when this situation, $300,000, you can afford to spend $30,000 to get that property back up and running, get it looking good, get it back on the market, and then be able to write that off. You're still going to be making a substantial amount of money. It was still worth your investment, worth your time, worth your energy. So, Betty, I hope that you will take that and run with it. So, is basis appraised value at the time of sale? Yes. That's a great question. So yes, that's what they're going to be looking at is what is the home value at the time that you have listed it and sold the property, not at like what you purchased it for or anything like that. Taxes are so complex. I cringe at them. Thank you, IRS. I am 100% with you, Lone. That's why I have a CPA. That's why I have a financial advisor. And by no means am I, making tons of money where I need to meet with my financial advisor every day for them to tell me all of these things. However, when it comes to just doing my own personal taxes, because I am self-employed, there's no way I'm touching them. There's absolutely no way that I'm going to mess with that because the IRS is somebody that I do not want to cross paths with. And I'm going to just pay the professional to look at all of that and make sure that I am dotting I's, crossing T's, doing everything that needs to be done. And so that's why in this specific video, we're looking at the legal ways to avoid paying taxes because IRS is not one to mess with. Money, money, money. Yes, that's exactly it, Anthony. Is this specific to Georgia? No. So this is throughout the US. And it's interesting because actually President Biden tried to actually this year take this option away, the 1031 exchange, not the, living in it for 2 years, that would have stayed. But the 1031 exchange was actually on his desk to be removed because they say that it is a way for people to avoid paying taxes on a regular basis. It's a way that investors just continue to, blow off paying their taxes, and it's money that should be coming into the government. It has not passed yet. So that's a great thing. I do know that it was on the ballot like probably 10 years ago. I think actually in 1997, a few things changed with all of this because used to you were not able to actually then live in the property. You were never able to make it a primary residence. And in 1997, they actually changed the rules for that. And you were able to make it a primary residence. It just had to be later on down the line. You couldn't purchase it for the intent of having it your primary residence. The purchase had to be with the intent of having it as an investment property. And then down the line, you could change it to your primary residence because obviously they were thinking, people would just take too much advantage of it. How does it triple net worth? Well, you have to look at the fact that if, let's just say, little by little, you were to, let's say that you took this property, you owned the $300,000 property that you purchased, you owned it for 5 years, and now that property is worth $600,000. You now sell that. You have basically $300,000 that you're making and you have to play with. So now you reinvest that on another property. You hold that for, let's say, 10 years. Now you're probably looking at close to $1 million that property is worth. So you're making a substantial bit more. So you can then reinvest that money. So each time you're just making more and more on the profits because you're holding out. So the smart thing to do, if you are able, would be to do that a couple of times, multiple times. Then hopefully by this point, your kids are off to college. It's just you and your significant other. You do move in back into that last property. You live in it for 2 years and you have avoided paying the capital gains taxes for 30 years. And so now you're able to reap the benefits of the long-term investment. That's why you always hear real estate is a long-term game, but it's also a long-term gain. Because if you wait it out and you take your time with it and you really look at it as a long-term investment, it can really be worth it in the long run. Man, that would piss off the rich guys down in Florida. I think it would piss everybody off. The one thing I will have to say, a question that I've been asked, and I think it is because here in Georgia, and this is specific to Georgia, we have tax benefits, tax exemptions, I'll say, for people that are over the age of 62 or 65. It just depends on the county that you live in here. But if you are over the age of 62 or 65, then you no longer have to pay the school tax. And so your property taxes, which this is a different ballgame than what we're talking about here, but this is how it relates in. Your property taxes, you are able to take, and not have to pay that school tax. So for here in Georgia specifically, school tax is significant. It's almost 50%, if not 50% of your property tax bill. So I gave you guys the example a couple weeks ago. My mom and I live very close together, and her property taxes were about $4,000 lower than mine, even though we live just 3-4 minutes away from one another, because she is able to take advantage of the senior exemption. And she always says, well, it's my right. I've lived this time and this is what I should be allowed to do. And I have no problem with that. If you're, staying in your home and you're 62, 65 or older, I will be right in your boat and be more than happy to take that exemption. However, that does not apply to when you're looking at the capital gains tax. There is never an age where you outage having to pay capital gains. I don't care if you're 55, 65, 95. Uncle Sam is getting your capital gains tax if you sell a property and owe it. If you have not moved back in or you're not putting that, reinvesting those funds, I don't care if you're 95 years old, you're paying your capital gains tax. So there's not a time that age is going to get you out of this. So please don't plan. I've had people say, well, I'll just wait and sell it, when I'm older and then I won't have to pay. That's not how this works, guys. That's a completely different type of tax. And so realistically, these are going to be your best bet options when you're looking at avoiding paying tax legally. And I would always tell people to make sure that you are talking to your financial advisor, talking to your CPA when you're looking at selling a property. I regularly, if I have an investor that's looking at selling something, I actually meet with the CPA or the financial advisor to tell them, hey, this is where we're thinking of listing it. This is what his gains would look like or her gains would look like. And that way they can all kind of come together. I don't need to be previewed to what he's going to be making and what that's going to look like, but I am providing them the information so that they have, all of the information that they need to make an educated decision. So that's always something that you want to look at and see long term what's going to make the best sense for you. Loan, I find it funny that taxes are so complex that we have to get a CPA to do them right. Um, yeah. I mean, it's something that anything with the government, like, I don't wanna be the one to screw that up because I don't want them knocking on my door. I don't want them sending me letters. So, I'm definitely gonna make sure that I'm paying somebody that has studied that. But, I mean, I guess it would be kind of similar to I'm not gonna let my husband do a, cavity filling on me. I'm gonna make sure that I'm going to a dentist. So, I don't mind paying somebody that knows what they're doing and has studied that in school. Only way to dodge the gain is to pass the asset on to your beneficiaries. That's the super long term play. It is, but even now, there are tax implications to passing them on if you do not have that property in a trust. And that's why it's so important. Again, looking at talking to more of your financial advisor than your CPA in this one, but making sure that you have your property, any properties that you have should be in a trust and not in your personal name. Because if you were to pass away or to deed that over to your heirs and it's in your personal name, there are still tax implications that you're going to be receiving. So something to keep in mind. The CPAs don't understand it either. That's what they describe. That's probably true because I will say I've had multiple CPAs throughout my real estate career the last 20 years. And it's funny how I think some of them just play it safer than others. Anthony's probably rolling over right now, having a heart attack with this conversation. But I do think that there are just ones that really follow the book and some that are willing to take a little bit more risk. And you have to decide as the person that is hiring that CPA, do you want to take that risk along with them? Or are you one that wants to make sure that you're playing safe and not have to take any of those, risks? Anthony, individual tax law is so messy. Corporate tax law makes more sense. And see, that's an area that I have absolutely no expertise whatsoever. So I will never give any type of advice or instruction on that. I will definitely stick to residential and making sure that you guys know all of the facts and terminology as far as that goes. Ray, the firms have all these big black books on the walls filled with information on taxes. They do. But I will say that some of those black books I feel like might be pushed under the table and hidden a little bit, but that's my own 2 cents. But hey, I appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. I hope this information was helpful. I know that sometimes when you're looking at investing in properties, or if, like I said, this is just something that you kind of fell into because you've held on to something and maybe it makes sense for you to hold on to it, because a lot of people don't think about your first house could actually be your first investment property. You just don't know it yet because that is a really, really smart way to get started. So I hope this information helps. If you have any questions at all, you guys know that you can reach out to me, shoot me an email, shoot me a text. I'd love to connect with you and talk more offline. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week.